Let's offer a Division II welcome to our keynote speaker, Lindsey Pollak.
Okay, you're my first audience in 2 years. You are now my favorite audience ever. Thank you so much for being here in person, and thank you to all those watching virtually for making the time. Thank you, Jim. Thank you to everyone at Division II, especially Terry and Maritza and Jill and Ryan, to my friend Lamar Pottinger at NCAA, to all women leaders in college sports who originally introduced me to D2. And I did want to shout out that I have some clients in the audience: Bentley University, Queens College, Winona State, Millersville, and Colorado School of Mines. Are you here? I will see you in Colorado in a couple of weeks. I'll be there in March. So thank you so much for including me today. We are going to talk about generational diversity, and I really want to position this topic as what I think is a potential way to come out of this pandemic in a really positive way. So I want to kind of shift your lens from all the negatives that we've been talking about to a potential solution. And I really approach this topic from two different perspectives. One is for all of you as leaders of groups, of staff in organizations, but also as mentors to the student athletes on your campuses who are going to be building their careers in the most multi-generational environment that we have ever seen. So here is the headline. For the first time ever, we have 5 distinct generations in the United States workforce. We have the traditionalists, the baby boomers. That's usually when boomers cheer for themselves, so boomers, welcome. The Gen Xers, millennials, and Generation Z. We have never had that before. Another reason that this is a unique moment in time is that in our country, we are very roughly split. About 50% of the population is under the age of 40, and 50% of the population is over the age of 40. And if you look at this chart closely, you'll know that the younger end of that, the millennials and the Gen Zs, have just tipped in 2019 to be the majority. So we are a very youth-driven future. Now, some people are not super happy about that news. And we all know this because every single person in this room has experienced the negativity and stereotyping that sometimes happens around being young. So baby boomers, you might have remembered the generation gap with the traditionalists, that you would never work as hard as the greatest generation, that you were hippies and your hair was too long. Gen Xers like me, we remember being told that we were the slackers and we would never live up to the baby boomers. And we were all living in Seattle, wearing flannel, listening to grunge music, drinking black coffee, and watching Reality Bites. Millennials are probably the most criticized and stereotyped generation in history, not because we said things about millennials that were so different than what we said about previous generations. It's all the same negativity. But millennials now had social media to amplify the negativity. It was actually really hard to decide which magazine cover to show you criticizing millennials because there are so many to choose from. So I went with one. I want you to see the whole thing. Millennials are the me generation. They are lazy, entitled narcissists who still live with their parents. I think it's just missing the stereotype that millennials want trophies for participation, which is the other big stereotype about millennials. And Gen Zs, as soon as the pandemic hit, who did we blame first? You, for being young and spreading this virus, which of course has been disproven. It's actually really interesting for someone interested in demographics to watch how the pandemic has shaped a generation in real time. We've even seen rates of students studying epidemiology, going to medical school, go up almost immediately following the pandemic. So we look at all this negativity, we look at all of this stereotyping, and it happens over and over and over again. I thought it would be fun to see if you could guess which era or which magazine story this quote is from. I see no hope for the future of our people if they are dependent on the frivolous youth of today. This morning's Wall Street Journal, maybe the 1960s, 1920s, the flappers. What do you think? Which era? Gen X, little earlier than Gen X. This is from the 8th century. We have literally been criticizing young people for all of human history. I want that to stop. And I don't want it to stop just because, well, it's not very nice. And by the way, I know that diversity, equity, inclusion is incredibly important to all of us, but is part of the key goals of Division 2. Imagine if I stood on this stage and said, women are lazy, entitled narcissists. You would never accept that. And yet when we do it about age, we laugh it off, right? I don't want us to stop shaming young people because it's not very nice. It isn't very nice. But I want us to stop shaming young people because I think it's a poor business decision. I think it's bad for an organization, for an individual's personal brand. Generational diversity is not a problem or a challenge to overcome. And I can't think of anyone other than all of you who are more invested in young people. But what if we decided to see this diversity of ages and perspectives as possibly the greatest opportunity that we have coming out of such an unbelievably disruptive time as Jim outlined? I think it's more important now than ever to look at the generational mix of your staff, of your university. And by the way, higher education is the most multi-generational of any environment because you have new students coming in every year and you have tenured professors who work much later than they do in most other industries. Perhaps you've heard a little bit about the Great Resignation. Perhaps you were literally reading an article about it right now, because it is everywhere. All we hear about is people are quitting their jobs, right? Look at those rates. It was the highest in September, the highest in October, the highest in November. By the way, look really closely at that data, because higher ed is actually a little lower than the average. I don't know the sports world in particular, but retail, leisure, hospitality are much higher. It's different in regions of the country. But there's no doubt that the talent market is very tight right now. 29%, almost a third of workers say they're thinking about leaving their jobs. And if you look at that generationally, you see that younger people at the beginning of their careers are more likely to be looking for jobs. Now, this is not hugely problematic because if you look at data, it's always been people in the earliest part of their career who are most likely to leave their jobs. They're still figuring out their careers and so on. But this is a pretty startling number that almost half of the youngest people in our workforce are looking for jobs. So how do we address generational diversity in a way that keeps all generations wanting to stay in their organization? Recruitment is often not the problem. It really is about the retention. So I've already thrown a bunch of generational terminology at you. I want to just dissect that a little bit and show you the chart. If you are not familiar with these terms or these years or these numbers, you did not miss this day in school. It is very much an art, not a science. You will also see a lot of different age ranges. I go with the Pew Research Center. I think they're most reputable. But take all this with a grain of salt. Some people feel that they fit into these categories. Some people feel that they don't. So here are the 5 generations that I mentioned. The traditionalists, you might look at that and say, why are we talking about that group? 77 plus. Did you know that today in this country, people are working longer and later than ever before? We have more Americans over the age of 85 in the workforce than ever before in history. 85. So people are working longer. Traditionalists are still in the workplace. Then we have the baby boomers, the largest generation ever born into this country. Gen Xers were slightly smaller. Millennials are a bigger generation again, primarily but not entirely children of the boomers. And then Gen Zs, primarily but not entirely children of Gen Xers. So we kind of get big generation, small generation. I want to point out a couple things on this chart that might be helpful to you as leaders. The first is a relatively new category or a sub-generation that we call the Zennials. Raise your hand if you've heard this term before, Zennial. So if you're a Zennial, you kind of feel like, well, I'm sort of a Gen Xer, but I'm sort of a millennial. The key marker of whether you're a Zennial is whether the first video game you played was Oregon Trail. Does that resonate with anybody? So it wasn't like Minecraft or Fortnite or very cool. You were like pressing 2 buttons and getting dysentery going across the country. That was your experience with video games. That is the Zennial category. What's interesting to me about Zennials is this cohort said, we don't fit into these big monolithic blocks. It doesn't make any sense to have, 15, 20 years. I feel like a little bit of millennial, a little bit of Gen X. So I think we're starting to kind of break off. There are people who've said, well, after Gen Z, besides the fact that we weren't very smart in the demographic world and we started with X, so we're out of letters at this point, that maybe this whole concept is kind of running out of steam. How could anyone in this fast-moving technological world have something in common with someone born 15 or 20 years old? It doesn't make any sense anymore. So I think we're starting to see that stratification. The other numbers I look at that I think are much more relevant to us when it comes to thinking about generations, and there are a lot of people who don't like this topic. They don't think we should break up humans into these groups, and who cares how old you are? Here's why I care, and I think you should care. I care about when someone entered the working world. What was their experience? So I'm a Gen Xer. I was born in the 70s. I don't think of myself as being of the 70s. I don't remember it. But I entered the workplace in the late 90s, in the dot-com era. That very much has formed how I see the world, what my experience has been, what I expect in a workplace. So to me, when you look at someone and know when they started working, what technology was available, what was the gender balance at that time, that to me is really relevant. I also wanted to point out again this really unique moment that we're in, that you have roughly 20%, 20%, 20%, 20% of 4 different generations. We're at a real moment of equality. Now, your particular staff might not be that. Your particular campus might not be that, or team or group, what have you. But overall, we have this really interesting mix, which is very, very different from other points in the workforce. I also wanted to mention that kids keep being born, even though we're out of letters. How many of you have heard the term Gen Alpha? That's going to be what they're going to call the next generation. So Gen Alpha is coming along, and I would argue that they already have had workplace experiences, because any young child today, probably because of the pandemic, has seen a parent either work from home in their house or has seen a parent named an essential worker having to leave and work despite the pandemic. So the experience of young children today, I think, is going to absolutely have an impact on how they see the world. If you saw a parent working from home for 2 years when you were little, and you go into an office and they say, we have no flexibility policy, that's not going to make any sense, because it's different from your life experience. So you've probably been going to conferences enough to know this was coming. I'm going to ask everyone to raise a hand for your generation, because who doesn't want to admit their age in front of all of their colleagues in a big public forum? Virtual people, you guys get to sit out on this one. Do we have any traditionalists in the room? Hi. Raise your hand if you work with a traditionalist. Have ever worked with a traditionalist? Okay, so still an influence. Baby boomers. Baby boomers. My fellow Gen Xers, my people, always overlooked, but here we are, the middle children. Millennials. I know you never saw that magazine cover because you don't use print media, so I hope that was educational for all of you, millennials. Gen Zs, hi Gen Zs. Okay. Anyone thinking about an alpha? No, sorry, did I just break every HR law that the NCAA has? So we have a really good generational mix in this particular room. Now I want you to think about your staff. I want you to think about the people you interact with on a regular basis, and I want to show you the data a little bit differently. This is now the workforce. I showed you the population. This is now just the workforce over roughly the past 25 years. I say to all of you, we have 5 generations, 20%, 20%, 20%, 20%, big deal. But I want to show you how different that is. When I started working, and many of you in the 90s, this chart starts at 1994, there were only 3 generations in the workforce. Gen Xers, we were just starting out. Boomers were by far the majority of the workforce. And traditionalists were still in the workforce, but slowly retiring out at what we considered traditional retirement age of 60, 65 years old. And over time, what you see is how much the working world has changed demographically. It used to be that roughly 70% of Americans had a pension plan. And so they would retire at 55, 60, 62, 65. And so you see this nice even line kind of easing its way out for the traditionalist or silent generation. Boomers don't follow that path. What you see is that the boomer line goes down a lot slower Then the millennial line goes up. Boomers are working longer and later into their lives. Many are working because they have to, for economic reasons. Many are working because they want to. They want to continue working. I was recently at a law firm that had a mandatory law firm partner retirement age of 65. But my HR client said, well, they can request an exemption. And I said, roughly what percentage of your law firm partners request an exemption when retiring at 65? And she said, roughly 100%. And we're going to see this with Gen Xers as well. So what used to be a 3-generation workforce has become a 5-generation workforce, not because young people keep graduating and coming in. That's always happened. What's different is that people are working longer and later. We've seen retirement numbers tick up a little bit because of the pandemic and because of the Great Resignation, but overall, over the past 20 or 30 years, we've generally seen a downward trend in retirements. So, now you know the numbers. Now you know who you're surrounded by. Why are we talking about this? Why is this important to think about generational diversity? Why does it matter? Just a couple of things that come to mind. I think we all agree that any diversity has value. If we were all exactly the same, we wouldn't come up with innovative ideas. We wouldn't come up with innovative solutions. We need a variety of skills and outlooks. We need to retain institutional knowledge while bringing in new people. And to be resilient in these difficult times, we need people with different perspectives. The stereotypical example is when the pandemic started and everybody had their first Zoom meeting. The younger people on the call said, what do we do? We've never been through this kind of difficulty before. And the older people said, how do I turn my camera on? And they needed the young people. And that simplicity, I stereotype a little sometimes, that is what we're talking about. How do we bring those perspectives together so that everybody has a valued voice? Also, I do want to acknowledge that age is just one element of identity. Intersectionality tells us that we are not just our age, we are our gender. We are our race or ethnicity, our sexual orientation. I know Division II has the highest percentage of first-generation students. That is incredibly important to this conversation. If you grew up outside of the United States, your generational perspective can be quite different. So I'm not saying that we should only look at generations. My fear is that you would leave this room and walk up to everyone today and say, how old are you? And then decide how to treat them. It is just one element. It is a clue when you are having a challenge, or when you seek an opportunity, or when you're having a conflict with someone to say, another tool in my leadership toolkit is the idea that there might be a generational issue at play here. So I see generations as helping us understand what experiences you might have had given how long you have been or not been in the workforce, and what your expectation might be, similar to those little kids watching their parents work from home. It doesn't guarantee your behavior or your personality. It's a clue to your experiences and expectations. So let's unpack that a little. And this is how I think about it. It's like a cultural difference. I love this quote from a British novelist, the past is a different country, right? If you grew up in the United States in 1950, wouldn't you say that's somewhat of a different country from the United States of today? And when we meet someone from a different country, we don't say your country is better or worse, good or bad. We say, oh, they do things differently there. I'd love to learn more about how you do things, and this is how I do things. I want to take away the idea that the past is good, the present is bad, or vice versa. It's just different, just like any element of diversity. So how is it different? A couple of charts. Let's talk about gender. We sort of take this for granted now, but women were not in the workforce in the kinds of numbers they are today, and certainly not in the collegiate athletics world. If you were in the work world in the 1960s as a woman and you walked into an advertising agency like on Mad Men, you did not expect to see that many other women there. Today, women outnumber men on your Division II campuses by a lot. That's a difference that we have to keep in mind. The expectation is different. How about race and ethnicity? Almost 80% of the United States identified as white in the traditionalist era. That was what the world looked like. And now, over time, as we become a more diverse country, those Gen Alphas will be the first generation in American history to be majority non-white. Young children today, school-age children, are majority non-white. That is a massive change in the demographics of this country. So if you look around your classroom in elementary school and you have this kind of diversity, and you look at employers that don't have that kind of diversity, it's a disconnect in your expectation of what the world looks like. How about a totally different category? How many of you, like me, were at the DMV the minute you turned 16? The minute. Why? Why? Why did you want your driver's license? Freedom, independence, hang out with my friends, get away from my parents. Did you know the share of 16-year-olds getting their driver's license is almost half of what it was in the 1980s? Almost half. Look at those numbers. They usually get it by age 19 or 20, but young people are not getting a driver's license as fast. Why? Well, we have Uber and Lyft, cars are expensive, the prices have gone up. But what researchers have found is one of the major reasons young people are not running to get their driver's license is I can be independent on my phone. I can hang out with my friends from my phone. I can date from my phone. I don't need to leave my house. Sending a kid to a room today, have we all learned this lesson? It's not a punishment. Making them come out of the room is the punishment. So what this means, to introduce the topic of technology, which of course we have to talk about, is that young people today, and I do not say this as a judgment, I say it as a fact, young people today have spent less time talking face-to-face to other human beings than any generation in human history. Double that with the pandemic. Young people simply have clocked fewer hours talking face-to-face. It's not a judgment. It's not better or worse. It's just different. And so if you are hiring a brilliant young student athlete, you have to think, they've probably never answered a phone call that was not someone calling for them. They've never answered a phone that was not someone calling for them. They've perhaps never answered a phone where you didn't have the option to hit decline. We didn't used to be able to do that. If you want someone to be able to chit-chat at an event, to interview people for a job, there is less experience with that. We have to teach things that might have been perceived as, quote, common sense to other generations. It is not good or bad, better or worse. All the time we used to spend teaching people how to use technology, we no longer have to do. But this is simply a fact of what it means to grow up today. Now, this is not without consequences, and everyone at Division II sent me a lot of materials on your division, and I think the commitment to mental health now more than ever is so important. But the rates of mental health concerns, anxiety, depression, loneliness, etc., have skyrocketed among young people in this country. And if you look, it's a pretty clear line that the younger you are, the more likely you are to have mental health concerns. I will tell you, I suffered pretty seriously from anxiety in college. I never went to get help for it. There was stigma. I never would have gotten help. So I think the lack of stigma is so critically important. But I think the number one workplace issue of 2022 is going to be mental health for all generations, but primarily for young people, and particularly, as you can see from the chart on the right, particularly young people of color. So the ability to talk about mental health, the ability to raise it as a concern, to seek help is hugely positive, but it is going to continue increasing the more young people we have in the workforce. But let's go back for a moment to technology, because I want to show that same chart I showed about the 5 generations, but I overlaid technology a little bit on this chart. By the way, do you guys all know what a fax machine is? It's a fax machine. Are we good? Okay. Okay, so technology. When you entered the workforce, you had a different, did I just black it out? Sorry. When you entered the workforce, you have a different expectation of what technology will be provided to you. Not good or bad, not better or worse. So here's a quick story about a fax machine. A friend of mine said, I feel really sorry for young people today that they don't get to send faxes. And I said, I'm sorry, you're going to have to explain that. And she said, well, when I started my career, I was just starting out. I didn't have any skills. And I remember everybody used to give me stuff to fax. And I'd have to stand at the fax machine and send lots of faxes. Because what nobody told you about faxes was you had to sit and watch every single page go through. And it was really boring, and you'd stand there. She said, but I'd be standing there in the middle of an office, sending these faxes. And I was bored, and I didn't have a cell phone because they didn't exist in the late 80s, early 90s. So I would listen. And I would overhear people talking on the phone. And I would overhear people chit-chatting. And I kind of learned how you handled a difficult client or how you had an uncomfortable conversation because I heard people doing it. Nowadays, we're all on email. We don't hear those conversations. She said I'd be standing there at the fax machine sending faxes, and people would walk by and they'd say, oh, hey, you're the new person, right? Oh, it's nice to meet you. What are you working on? And it was a form of networking and casual relationship building. And she said, also, it was really boring. I didn't have a cell phone. There was nothing to do, so I read every page I faxed, and I started to learn stuff about the business. Is it easier and more, quote, efficient now to attach a PDF? Yeah. But what do you miss? You miss that learning, that hearing. You miss the networking and those casual relationships. You miss all the time to just sit and learn. And we as leaders have to think about how do we add that time back in? How do we CC young people on emails to say, this is how I'm going to handle this? Come sit in my office and listen to me have this conversation. That doesn't happen by accident anymore. And many of us who did come of age in the fax era, we don't remember how we learned that stuff. It just kind of happened. But it didn't. It happened because of the technology that did or didn't exist. The cell phone, email. How many of you worked before email? How many of you worked before email? How many of you have never had a job where you didn't have email? That's a completely different way of using email, right? My first email address was Lindsey.Pollak at whatever my company was. My sister is 9 years younger than I am. Her first email was pookie3@AOL.com. Different use of the same technology. How about LinkedIn? How many of you are on LinkedIn? So LinkedIn comes around 2003 or so. It's not hard to learn how to use LinkedIn. Anyone of any age can do that. But I know in my first job at Working Woman magazine, I went to work and I liked work, so I went home and went back the next day. Now, when you add LinkedIn to the mix, every single day you log into LinkedIn, you can see, well, Maritz's job is a little cooler than yours, and Jim did something really great today, and Ryan just got promoted. What's happening for you? And you get this FOMO, this fear of missing out. There might be something better. There might be something better. So it's not the technology of LinkedIn. It's the expectation it creates that there's always something better out there anytime I log in. Alexa, my daughter is 10 now, but she was about 7. We went on vacation to Maine. And we have an Alexa at home. And we walked into our hotel room in Maine, and my daughter said into the air of the hotel room, Alexa, what's the weather in Maine? She assumed every room she walked into would have an Alexa because we had one at home. How would she ever know that every room in the world does not have an Alexa? Because that was her expectation. And now what we have been through collectively over the past 2 years, we can never go back from Zoom, from having virtual audiences, from some level of flexibility, because it has now become an expectation. Once you have something, you really can't take it away. So the bottom line, which aligns beautifully with Division 2, is there is no such thing as one size fits all in the workforce, on campus, for any student, for any professional. I can't tell you how often my consulting clients say, okay, what is the one employee benefit every generation wants? What is the one learning tool that every generation wants? There is not an answer. We need more choice. We need more optionality. The only answer is to think and, not or. Not one, but many. So, how do we do that? I want to give you 2 suggestions and then some very specific ideas. The first is the book that you so generously received from Division 2. I came up with the idea of a remix because I wanted to think about how do we create a world that doesn't throw away the old and say the new is better. And I thought about music. In music, a remix is a song where you take a classic song, a great song, and you don't say, well, that song should retire. It's been around for a while. That song is old. No, you say, that's a great song. What else can we do with it? What can we add to it? What can we change or alter about it? And I interviewed a couple DJs and producers about the word remix before I used it on a book title. And one DJ told me that when she plays a wedding, and weddings always have people of different generations, she said, when the dance floor is empty, a little trick I have is I play a remix. I said, why? She said, because the older people at the wedding know the classic song and they come and dance and feel included. And the younger people know the remix version and they come and dance and feel included. But she also said everybody's also a little uncomfortable because the older people don't know the new version and the younger people don't know the older version. So everybody is included, but also has to adapt a little bit. And so that is my vision for the workplace that we can create, the environment, the campus culture, the team culture that we can create, is that everybody feels included, but we all have to bend a little bit. And for each of you as individuals, I want to suggest that you embrace another generational term, which was coined by an entrepreneur named Gina Pell, and it's the word perennial. She defines it as ever-blooming people of all ages who continue to push up against their growing edge, always relevant and not defined by their generation. How can you transcend the idea of generations? Not act a different age than you are, but learn your history, know what came before you, and simultaneously keep up with the times. I suggest we all become perennials. And here's how we're going to do it. I have 5 suggestions. First, a reminder that not all these will be relevant to you depending on your situation, your particular role, your particular environment. So choose what will be most beneficial for you. And one of my suggestions, and I think this is really important in the context that Jim talked about, we often think, well, the pandemic happened, we have to change everything. It has to be monumental. Kind of did that yesterday, but other than that, where can you adapt by just 5%? Where can we flex a little bit? Where can we change just a tad? Because if every single one of us changed 5%, the net result would be enormous. So take what I say and apply it to your situation. In other words, make it yours. They told me to say that. Okay. # make it yours. Okay, but it actually worked. Number 1, let's talk about communication. You will not be surprised to know that 81% of people say that the vast majority of situations where they feel like there's some kind of generational thing going on here comes to communication. I assume that you're going to communicate one way, you assume I'm going to communicate another way. So there is a really simple solution that comes from Michael Watkins, who is a professor at Harvard Business School, and what he says is, why don't you ask people how they want to communicate? Why don't you tell people how you plan to communicate? He calls it the style conversation, and he recommends doing it anytime you have a new employee, or you become a boss for the first time, or work with somebody for the first time. But simply saying, if you are on the junior end, saying to your new boss, what is the best way to communicate with you? Do you generally prefer email? Is it okay to text you? Is your style more formal or informal? I know everybody has different schedules today. Is there a time of day that's not good to reach you? Simple questions. If you are a leader, a manager of other people, I believe it's an act of generosity to tell people how to communicate with you. And to say, hey, you know what? I'm just not a texter. I don't like it. I'm really sorry, but the best way to get in touch with me is to call me. Because we make assumptions. I was working with an administrator who, during COVID, when we were locked down and everybody was working from home, she made a habit of calling each of her employees. She had a team of 5 or 6. She was a baby boomer, and her team were primarily Millennials and Gen Zs. She said, I really wanted them to hear my voice. I wanted to check in on everybody, have that personal touch. So I called each person one by one. And she said, I'm really disappointed. I got really frustrated because I would call and many of them wouldn't answer. They weren't home or they weren't available, and they would email me back. And she immediately jumped to the conclusion that young people are lazy, entitled narcissists, and they never picked up the phone and they couldn't talk, and sort of got into that. And I said, well, did you ask your team why they emailed you back instead of called you? And so she did, and you know what they said? We know you're really busy and stressed. We didn't want to bother you by calling you back. I work from the assumption that everybody has the best intentions. We just make assumptions about what other people want, and we don't check those assumptions. Whereas if she had said, hey, I'm leaving you a voicemail. I really want to hear your voice and let you know you're okay. Please call me. All of you will recognize this being on campuses, but I had one administrator who said, I just want to mention a story. She was working in student affairs, And she said, definitely at a Division II school. I'm sure she was at a Division II school. And she said, I told my students, because she was running the residence hall, she said, I told my students, call me anytime. And they called at 1 in the morning, 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning. She said, oh, no, my anytime means before 10. So just know that. That's the style conversation. Number 2, how about employee retention? How do we keep people in this great resignation? Google did a study called Project Oxygen. They started in 2008. They replicated the exact same study in 2018, 10 years later. They studied 10,000 employees at Google for what made the best people managers whose teams excelled. It wasn't just that they liked their manager, their teams achieved their goals. And this is Google, so it was very data-driven. According to Google's study, employees across all generations excelled when their managers did 3 things. They made time for one-on-ones, they helped employees solve problems, and they took an interest in their lives and careers. How many of you would say that the best bosses you ever had, you could probably describe this way? They made time for one-on-ones, they helped their employees solve problems, and they took an interest in their lives and careers. It wasn't about the technical skill. It was about, I think you genuinely care and are invested in me across all generations. So how do you do this when you oversee a lot of people, when you're extremely busy? I think this is where we remix and go back to a classic that still works. How many of you have read The 1 Minute Manager? One of the best-selling business books of all time. It came out originally in 1982. It was re-released as the new 1 Minute Manager in 2016, right about that time that millennials were peaking in the workplace. And it's really, really simple. In the moment, for 1 minute, catch somebody doing something right and be specific. Maritza, I like how you're jotting that down in your bullet journal right when we talked about it. 1 minute of suggested improvement. Blue pen instead of red pen might have been more effective so other people could read it. And I would add, because of COVID and the mental health imperative, 1 minute of well-being check-in. And by the way, Maritza, how are you really? How are you doing? You okay? I just want to check in. Let me know if you need anything. Every employee once a day. And if you are the employee and you are not getting this from your manager, I think it's okay to say, hey, can I just grab you for a minute? What went well today? What didn't? And I just wanted to let you know I'm just feeling a little overwhelmed. These small moments, these micro moments are so powerful. That's the kind of 5% change. Now, above this, LinkedIn just put out a study, and they asked people again of all generations, what do you most want in a job? It's not money for everybody. For most people today, what has more currency, once the money is appropriate, what has more currency across every generation today is professional development, is learning, upskilling, and reskilling. Because if you're just starting out, building those skills, building that resume is the most important thing to you once your basic needs are covered. If you're mid-career, staying relevant is incredibly important and feeling like you're not going to age out. So you need that reskilling and professional development. And if you're towards the later end of your career, you want to make sure that you're passing on what you know. You want to make sure that if you want to continue working, you will have the skills to do that. And so we often talk about exit interviews, right? People leave and you say, well, why did you leave? What didn't we give you? And you say, well, I didn't get this, I didn't get that. And how many times have you had someone leave your organization and they tell you in an exit interview why they left and you say, we could have done that. Why didn't you tell me sooner? So a lot of progressive organizations of many generations are having what they call stay conversations. Not an exit interview, but once a year, twice a year, really casual. Hey, I just want to check in, see how you're doing. Here's some suggested questions just as an example. What more would you like to learn? What's really motivating to you? How do you like to be recognized? Everybody is not the same. We think, I'm going to give you a bonus. And we say, actually, I'd really love to leave early on Wednesday afternoons. That has more value to me than a bonus. Or, I'm really happy in the company, but I just don't think this role is right. What would it take to transition to something else? Don't wait until it's too late to have those conversations. And don't assume because somebody is over a certain age that they don't want to have these conversations anymore, or that somebody is too junior to have them. The stay conversation is another tool in your toolkit for employees of all generations. I hear this all the time with junior talent. How do we keep hot junior talent? We have a stay conversation. We should be doing that with Xers and Boomers as well. Let's talk a little bit about culture. And here I want to introduce another letter because we don't have enough acronyms in this world. We talk a lot about diversity, equity, and inclusion. But one of the things that I'm hearing from recruiters is, okay, we figured out how to bring in more diverse people. We can recruit those people. We've got the diversity. We've made it equitable. We're including people. But then we lose them. We're not retaining people because they don't feel like they belong here. So a lot of organizations are now starting to think about DEI and B for belonging. How do you not just bring someone in, but make sure that they truly feel part of the team, no matter what generation or any other identifying factor they have? So how do you do that? One example is to deliberately create multi-generational teams. Just as now, when we're putting together a panel, we would not have a panel of all white men. I think we all know that that is not going to be an inclusive situation. Well, when you are planning an event, when you are having a committee, when you are running an athletic organization, you include people of different generations and say we need to get those different perspectives. So whenever you're planning anything, I was working with a nonprofit and they were planning their big fundraiser. I said, I think we're going to do, a big event again. But, what do we do? Because we have older people and younger people. And I feel like the older people are going to want a big sit-down gala black tie dinner. But the young people want like a bowling night or a cocktail party. And somebody in the meeting said, well, what if we did both? What if we had a cocktail party before the gala? And lo and behold, a lot of older people said, well, I like cocktails, I like bowling, I want to go to that one. And a lot of young people said, I kind of want to put on a tux and go. And by having those different voices, they realized it didn't have to be this either or. I worked with a cosmetics company that borrowed a term from engineering, which is 100 paper cuts. Anyone heard of that? What are all the little things we just have to bang out, right? Not the huge things, just like the little paper cuts, the little annoyances, the little problems. And they said, every culture, people feel like their needs aren't being met. They have ideas for the organization. How do we share that and fix those little problems that can really explode? And so she tasked a multi-generational team. She was really deliberate in making sure every generation was represented. And she said, make a list of all the little things about this company that you don't like and give me some ideas for how to solve them. And by the way, your budget is 0. Familiar with that budget? And they did. And I'll just share one of the ideas. One of the ideas they said was, we don't hang out with each other. Everybody eats at their desk. We're all really busy all the time. We like each other, but we don't want to do it after work because some people want to go home. It's not really fair to have just after work social activities. So they said, well, we have one little conference room in the office. What if from 12 to 1, we called the conference room the lunchroom? And just for that hour, 12 to 1, that shut down for meetings and it was only available for people who want to hang out and have lunch together. Won't cost anything. We're repurposing something and we can move forward. And the leader of the company said, great, I love it, fantastic. It was getting different brains to think about problems, deliberate multi-generational teams. On a benefit example, I just wanted to throw this in. I know a lot of us are not making benefit decisions, but here's an example. I was working with a consulting company, and they found that they wanted to have the best benefits that they could possibly offer for their employees. And a big, prestigious benefit, of course, was having a 401k match for their employees. You contribute to the 401k, the company matches it, right? We would all agree that is a gold standard benefit. And then they looked at the data of their company and they found that the young people, particularly the millennials, were not taking the match. They were not contributing to their 401ks. And some of the people on the older end of the spectrum said, well, they obviously don't understand financial security. They're not taking advantage of this wonderful thing. They're lazy, entitled narcissists. We know the drill by now. They said, well, maybe we should put together a group of people to discuss it. Put together a multi-generational committee, and lo and behold, what did the millennials say was the reason that they were not contributing to their 401ks? We have to pay our student loans first. And PricewaterhouseCoopers became the first company in the United States to say, we are going to give you a choice. We will either match your retirement contribution, or we will match your student loan benefit repayment. And guess what happened in the remix? It wasn't just the students who took the benefit. It was the parents and grandparents of young people who wanted to help pay back their student loans. They remixed a benefit to give everybody what they needed. 2 more suggestions, and then I'd love to take a couple of questions. How about mentoring? Mentoring is a classic. Mentoring is fantastic. Mentoring shouldn't go away. But if you look at this stat, the ASTD says executives point to mentoring as playing a key role in their careers, not a single mentor-mentee relationship. I think it puts too much pressure that we each have to find some Yoda who's going to stand on a mountain and tell us everything we need to do in our careers. If you wanted to find a mentor to tell you how to run an athletic department during a pandemic, how many of you would have found a mentor on that? Didn't exist. So why don't we remix the idea of mentoring? Traditional mentoring is great, but how about reverse or co-mentoring? The CEO of Estee Lauder Companies, Fabrizio Freda, runs one of the most successful global organizations in the world. He has a reverse mentor who's a 24-year-old employee of his company, and once a quarter, she takes him, the CEO of Estee Lauder, shopping for makeup. Why? Because what could be more important to the CEO of Estee Lauder than understanding how a young woman shops for makeup? By the way, best job ever. Just take the CEO shopping for makeup and he pays. And one of the things he taught her many years ago, he has a new one every year, she was the first one who said to him, hey, do you want a coffee? And he said, yeah, great, let's stop. She said, great, what do you want? He said, what do you mean? She said, well, I'll pre-order it on the Starbucks app so it's ready when we get there. And she was the first one to show him that. That has potential for selling cosmetics, yes? That you could pre-order and pick it up. She showed him that. Another manager, if you don't have time to take all of your students shopping for makeup or have them take you, once a week walks in to his team and says to the junior people, hey, you guys, put a new app on my phone. I want to see what you're using. Yes, they showed him Tinder. But I want to make the argument, don't you think swiping left and swiping right has been part of the culture? And if you didn't know what that was, you would feel left out. What I aspire to be as a perennial is someone who has a multi-generational board of advisors. I don't want just one person. This is a complicated world. I try to have people advising me and talking to me and challenging me and giving me ideas from all of the generations. And that's what I aspire for all of you to have as a perennial, a multi-generational board of advisors. And finally, the last suggestion I want to give is on the idea of purpose. People who find their work highly meaningful are much more likely to stay with their organizations in any economy. People always ask me, what is the most successful multi-generational environment you've ever seen? And I will tell you every time it's a political campaign. Because if you believe in a candidate to help run our country or run your state or your organization, you don't care if the person next to you is 90 years older than you or younger, you believe in the same cause. You want the same goal. When we align people with purpose, we bring everybody together. Nothing is more powerful. KPMG realized this when they decided to engage every single one of their employees in describing why they did the work that they did. We talk about this at our retirement parties, what the work meant to us. I think we should talk about it every day and put it on posters and start every meeting by asking, why are we here? Well, we're going over the budget numbers, but why? What is this going to lead to? KPMG did a program called the Purpose Project, and they asked people to write down, what is your job? What do you actually do? Not your job, I fill out spreadsheets. But you can see here in the middle, I combat terrorism. This is a young woman who looked at documents to make sure that money wasn't being laundered. She said, yeah, I look at a lot of spreadsheets, but my job is to combat terrorism. KPMG is one of the big 4 professional services firms. They were always number 4 on the list of best places to work, employee satisfaction. The year they launched the Purpose Project, they went from number 4 in employee satisfaction to number 1 in 1 year because they aligned people with purpose. My purpose is to help all of us see the possibilities of a multi-generational environment. And again, being in a campus community is one of the most powerful, impactful places to do this work. So thank you to everyone at NCAA Division II. Thank you to all of you, as well as people watching virtually. And I know that you're not all millennials, but I did want to offer you a trophy for participating in this keynote session this morning. Thank you very much. I believe we have 7 or so minutes for questions if you want to walk to a microphone. I also saw a lot of you taking photos, which is great, but I wanted to let you know I have a download of the tips in today's session. I also would be delighted to give you my email address if you want to text the word leaders to 66866. And I believe also the slide deck will be available in the conference app as well. Any questions? Hi.
Hi, thank you so much for your comments today. I've been reading more recently about the declining number of men entering college and how they're not necessarily going into trades or the military or something else productive. And with that also dying more deaths of despair. And so I'd be curious if you could speak to that at all and what might be going on and how we could also help them.
Excellent question. Thank you. We saw a lot of the numbers of men in the full-time paid workforce go down during the Great Recession. So this trend that you're talking about really started around 2007, 2008. I think a couple of things are going on. One is I think what we see as children has such an impact on how we see the world. And I think a lot of children saw men leaving the workforce, not working, not being able to find work. And I think that's now trickled down and lasted longer. I think also, unfortunately, in this country, we have a bit of a pendulum swing problem, which is we increase, put all of our money and all of our resources towards getting more women in the higher education system, and so men start to decline. We don't have as many programs. So I think, again, we need to modulate that we can do both, right? Helping women doesn't mean getting men out of the workforce. So I think it's really important. I also think that it is an issue of the stigma, again, of mental health. The more we make mental health resources available to everybody and encourage it, one of the best ways to do that, if you are a man worried about young men, is to speak about your own mental health, to speak about utilizing mental health resources yourself. I think a lot of CEOs and athletic directors and university presidents need to step up and say, I have had mental health challenges, or I have gone to therapy. And I think the NFL is doing a really phenomenal job of these big, beefy guys saying, yeah, I go to therapy. So I think that there is an antidote, but I think it did kind of start in 2008, and I'm really glad that you're thinking about that issue. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi, how's it going?
Good.
You mentioned earlier that perhaps more important than the age a generation was born in is when they're entering the workforce. And the group up here is highly comprised of people that are either recently entering the workforce or will pretty soon. And the next 20 or so years are going to be pretty essential to us. So my question is, how do you see the multi-generational workforce evolving in the next 20 or so years?
Oh, I love that question. I mean, I'm not like Team Gen Z just because you're going to run the future, but I'm also Team Gen Z because I say this very seriously. You're pioneers because we have absolutely no idea how to start a career in a pandemic. And you are going to be the only ones who know. And that means you get to create it and tell us, hey, this worked, this didn't. Or, you know what, we really miss coming to conferences, so we're going to keep conferences in the future. But you know what we don't really miss? A lot of email. So we're going to move to other forms of communication. So I think you have a lot to tell organizations and should speak up and I think will speak up about how this kind of hybrid environment, whatever that's going to look like, is going to be. The other thing I should say, I didn't talk a lot about birth rates, but birth rates are very, very low in this country right now, which means that, you know, baby boomers kind of knew there were going to be a lot of people coming up behind them. You don't really have that luxury. So I think your generation is going to have to rely on all of us for a little bit longer than you might anticipate. So more than just cultivating your management of younger people, I think one of the biggest skills you can all learn is how to work with all of us and manage people who are at different stages of our career. So I think we're going to kind of flip-flop, that you're going to be in leadership roles, but managing people who might even be 20 or 30 years older than you are. I also think, finally, and this might even go without saying to your generation, but we are in a global economy. So assuming that you are going to work in a global way no matter what you do, I think is also part of that growth. But I love that you asked the question, and I just, can we just have a round of applause for this group? Being here is, thank you. You're doing it. You're doing it by being here and taking on a leadership role. So
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. These Gen Zs are shutting the rest of you down with the Q&A here. I just want to say hi.
Thank you so much for being here today.
Of course.
So I wanted to ask, in today's pandemic world, networking looks a whole lot different than it once did. So what are your best tips and tricks for networking in an online kind of environment?
Well, first of all, you have a network in this room, and any organization, whether it is the school that you go to and tapping into the alumni of that, but also any organization you belong to, any sport that you play, any major that you're in, talking to other people who are aligned with that is a really easy way to kind of build instant rapport. Rather than being one of many, you suddenly have something in common. And one of the things that I always say to students in particular is a lot of times someone who's older or in a really high leadership role will say, call me anytime, reach out, ask for help. And a lot of people think they don't really mean that. We mean it. Do we mean it, everybody? We mean it. So when anybody says, hey, I'd love to help you, give me a call, don't hesitate to reach out, I would say take that at face value And you know what? You're probably not going to, I don't like, the word networking almost feels old-fashioned because it sounds like I'm going to go and kind of give my cards to everybody. If you meet one person at this conference, that's one person, but then keep in touch. And then you meet another person and keep in touch. It's not about the quantity in one moment. I think it's about the maintenance of those relationships over time that really builds a deep, authentic network. And when I think about the people who are most important in my professional career, it's people I met and have kind of known authentically for many years as opposed to meeting a lot of people at once. So also your peer network of each other is going to stick with you a long time. So I encourage you to maintain those relationships. But great question that you're thinking about that. Thank you.
Thank you.
One more. Oh, hi. Terrific.
Thanks again for everything. Just a quick question, and I appreciated all the information you were putting out. What are you reading? How are you keeping up with all these trends that we're seeing today?
Oh, I love that question. First of all, I think trying to be a perennial, my number one question that I ask anyone when I meet them is, what are you reading? What are you keeping up with, right? I want to know what you're reading. I want to know what you're reading. I read a lot of just kind of mainstream news, but to be really honest with you, does anyone else use Google Alerts? I have Google Alerts for terms like millennial, Generation Z, multigenerational, and that kind of lets Google do the work for me to kind of keep up with these various topics. But I'll just leave you with one last little rule of thumb I have, is whenever more than one person tells me to read something or try something or listen to a podcast, if I hear it once, I'm like, If I hear it from two different people, that's sort of my trigger to watch something or make sure that it's part of my knowledge base. So that's how I try to keep up with these issues. But thank you for the question. I really appreciate it. Good. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.